was indeed a deplorable spectacle. In the dim light of a foggy November day, the sick room was a gloomy spot, but it was that gaunt, wasted face staring at me which sent a chill down my heart. Well, Watson, we seem to have fallen upon evil days. Hello everybody, I'm Kate Cast, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. As we all still process the events of the previous episode, we are put through an even more intense ordeal in The Lying Detective. After Mary's death, emotions are still high. John refuses to see Sherlock while he's locked himself away and is indulging in some old habits. The only chance they have of coming back together is, what else, catching a potential murderer, as the deceptive Culverton Smith makes a dark time even more difficult and a challenge the great detective might not be able to face. Again, hate to spoil things early in terms of my rankings, but The Lying Detective is a source of whiplash for me. Where The Six Thatchers was my least favorite episode of the series, The Lying Detective is one of my all-time favorites. But let's look at it closer. This episode is one that has a lot of moving parts that's going to make recapping and breaking it down a bit more difficult, but thankfully it's all connected to one common thread: the aftermath of Mary's death. What it's done to the relationships between our characters, to each of them as individuals, or how trying to stop the criminal of the week will contribute to this estrangement. This may be the toughest challenge this cast has been put through on a character level, which is fitting after what happened. I may not completely be on board with the idea of killing Mary, but at the very least, I appreciate that it's not something everyone could shake off in time for the next adventure. This was a massive loss of a character who was important to all of them, and this episode really makes you feel the erratic effects of that grief. In a way, it does show how much of an important character Mary was. So much so that the show isn't quite ready to let her go yet.
Are you disapproving the face on?
Well, seeing as I'm inside your head, I think we can call that self-loathing.
Hey, shut up, you're dead.
Yeah, one of the many ways John is dealing with Mary's death, and I say that with the strongest possible quotation marks, is by seeing Mary around whenever he's thinking something through. I know this is a trope as old as dirt when it comes to beloved dead characters, but it's one of those ancient tropes I have a real soft spot for, and I really loved how it was used here. Plus, it gives Amanda Abington even more chances to be absolutely brilliant as this character who was taken away far too soon.
Spending all night talking to a woman who wasn't even there.
Oh, shut up, you.
That's just one of the many ways John is struggling with his grief. He's almost closed himself off completely and even sent his daughter off to be with unidentified friends since he doesn't feel he can care for her right now. This is the kind of thing I was talking about last episode of pawning Rosie off in lazy ways, but I think they get away with it here because it shows just how much John can't cope. He's frustrated with how much he can't be there for Rosie right now, so much so that it's implied he's drinking in his attempts of dealing with this. And with what little we know about John's family history, that one shot where we get this information is pretty bleak. Meanwhile, Sherlock, unbeknownst to John, also isn't doing great. And I gotta say, they do an amazing job at getting that across to us very quickly. When we catch up with Sherlock in the episode, Baker Street is in shambles, Sherlock himself is unkempt and lethargic, and needles and syringes aren't anything that can hold them. You know immediately what he's been doing all this time, and it makes my stomach churn to see Sherlock's drug use go this far, basically becoming an addictive recluse. It's not just the setting that gets us all across either. Cumberbatch adds some great touches to his body language to emphasize just how much this is affecting Sherlock. The makeup team really made him look like hell. Even his deductions, while more elaborate visually, are less sophisticated, with things like the typed out text being replaced by crude chalk. If there's one good thing that comes from Sherlock's drug-addled viewpoint, is that it really amps up the visual possibilities. The crew really took advantage of the surrealism the situation this episode allows them to toy with in a show that's already known for creative visual direction. There are some really cool ways of presenting Sherlock's deductions in particular, which get more sophisticated and crisp as he gets back into the groove of helping a potential client. I don't think we've seen anything this elaborate for the thought process explanations since A Scandal in Belgravia, but most of that is just classic Sherlock. It gets way more ambitious once Sherlock really starts getting into the case. I think this is one of the best brain blasts in the entire series. From Sherlock following a thread of logic from a single contradiction.
You said your life turned on one word. Names aren't one word, they're always at least two.
And I'd call out the likes of Cher, Madonna, and Eric, but this feels more like a balance of probability deduction, so I'll let it slide. That builds and builds as Sherlock's drug use catches up with him, as he's reaching the realization of what that one word is. Anyone. Unfolding into a sequence that has so much going on at once. It's overwhelming to the senses as Sherlock's lucidity and perspective is constantly shifting, but not in a way that's difficult to follow. It's a set of events that is so well executed and brilliant at presenting and breaking everything down. This is some of the best camera and editing work in the series. Even the introduction of our villain includes drug-induced confusion, which really complements Sherlock's viewpoint once we get to him. It gives many of the events an off-kilter vibe that permeates throughout the episode, difficult to distinguish what's real and what's imagined. And unlike the last episode, that heightens the drama of the events since you can trace that confusion to a single source. A source that raises the stakes considerably and adds to the drama. It's creative, stunning, and contributes highly to the story the episode wants to tell. What more could you ask for? Well, before we really get into the meat of this case, maybe we should see what references are brought up during this massive crisis in our segment. Remember how I said that the references were kind of scarce in the Six Thatchers? Well, now they're really scarce. Seriously, outside of the story that inspired this episode, I am grasping at straws here. I can only find a couple, and the Sherlock Wiki gets less helpful by the time you hit the sign of 3, so if I missed any, I apologize. But let's look at the few I did find. With the need for massive amounts of drugs comes the return of Billy Wiggins, and the immediate departure of Billy Wiggins. Oh well, it was nice to see him again at least. It's kind of a shame the show never found more for him to do. At one point, Sherlock talks about some of his and John's past cases, mentioning Blessington, a name taken from the story The Resident Patient, and the Drearcliff House, which was a location in the Basil Rathbone movie The House of Fear. I know I said I'd leave movie references out of this section, but I have to work with what I've got. When Sherlock talks about his desire to take the criminal in this episode down, he says something that sounds a lot like a sentiment he shared towards his desire to stop Moriarty in The Final Problem.
If the only thing I ever do in this world is drive him out of it, then my life will not have been wasted.
Another quote from Sherlock that I always thought was pretty powerful in this episode turns out to be from one of the original stories, The Veiled Lodger.
Your life is not your own. Keep your hands off it.
It's a nice hidden gem of a moment from the classic stories that I'd never come across before. But speaking of quotes, it looks like they can get this line right outside of Victorian times.
The game's afoot.
Since that's about it beyond the episode's main inspiration, let's talk a bit about a reference to a different book that has been brought up a few times, Sharonford. Sharonford was a character conceived for the unofficial Sherlock Holmes biography, Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, written by William S. Baring Gould. This book was published over 30 years after Conan Doyle's death, though many in The Great Game consider it to be canon. Think of it like the Sherlock Holmes equivalent of the Star Wars EU. In fact, the show has referenced this biography before. When Sherlock tells John his full name in his last vow, it's the full name from Gould's book.
William Sherlock Scott Holmes.
Sorry?
That's the whole of it.
There's some crazy stuff in this thing that I could point out, but let's stay on topic. Who is Sharonford? Well, Sharonford is Sherlock and Mycroft's older brother. Yes, this book created a whole other Holmes sibling before it got popular, who wasn't in any of the original stories because he looked after the Holmes family estate. Sherlock has been hinting at a secret third sibling in its story for a while now, bringing up Sharonford by name in The Six Thatchers, and in this episode, Mycroft lets things slip one too many times to the point that John picks up on it and starts to interrogate him about it. Trust me, this little inclusion is going to be much more significant later, but what we hear of it in this episode is mostly set up for what's to come, so for now, let's move on. While the line detective may be lacking in one-off references, it makes up for it with the amazing reimagining of the story that inspired this episode, The Dying Detective. A very underrated yet popular later story about Holmes pretending to be gravely ill to catch the despicable Culverton Smith, played here by Arnim Zola himself, Toby Jones. Culverton Smith is sort of a B-tier Holmes villain. Memorable, but not iconic. Sort of like Milverton. His actual crime wasn't anything special among the 56 stories that comprise the Holmes library, but there was just something about his character that made you squirm. The most disturbing thing about this man is not only the conniving lengths he went to get Holmes out of the way, but that he took such joy in what he thought was his victory. Gleefully watching the only man who could send him to jail slowly and painfully painfully dying. And I think it's that response, that gloating conversation he has with Holmes, that was the foundation for this new version of the character. Here, Culverton is a beloved public figure, a benefactor and media personality, but he's also a serial killer. Right from his introduction, Culverton Smith may officially earn the title of the show's creepiest villain. Sherlock even declares him the greatest monster he's ever faced. Sorry, boys. Toby Jones does a remarkable job with this part, being just charming and charismatic enough that people don't really question when he says something a bit sinister. They feel uneasy about it from time to time, but are willing to let him get away with more because he's so important. You know this guy has people's trust when he regularly asks one of his employees for a memory-interfering drug, and the guy doesn't ask why. Culverton Smith represents something that every generation comes to terms with at some point, that the most beloved and influential public figures can be despicable people, abusing their power for their own desires and getting away with it because most don't want to see them that way. Your O.J. Simpsons, your Kevin Spaceys, we all experience this at some point. Sherlock takes it to the ultimate extreme, and there are some scenes where it's really blood-curdling, to the point that Culverton uses Sherlock's claims that he's a killer as a marketing strategy. If that isn't the definition of toying with your enemy, I don't know what is. At one point, there's a scene where Culverton is basically spelling out his entire method of how he kills, and he's still clever enough to get away with it. It's nuts. But this just might be the adversary to bring Sherlock and John back together. After all, a serial killer did that the first time, maybe it'll work again. Fingers crossed. Though even with this threat in the shadows, John still needs someone to push him back into Sherlock's life after weeks away. And the person to do that is none other than Mrs. Hudson. I think this is paying homage to a plot point in The Dying Detective where Mrs. Hudson calls on Watson to tell him that Holmes is ill. She basically does the same thing here, but has more elaborate means of getting things done. Sherlock's version of Mrs. Hudson has always been a soft mother figure to the Baker Street boys who was never afraid to speak her mind, but when did she become such a badass? This is truly Una Stubbs' time to shine. Outside of her giving her opinion and that one time she was held hostage, Mrs. Hudson mostly stays out of the main events of a story, but here she interferes constantly, and it's the best watching her go to these lengths to try and make these two get their acts together. Not just through direct intervention, but by showing how well she knows them. From being sympathetic towards John's grief, but strict enough to be adamant that he can't keep pushing Sherlock away, to knowing Sherlock's habits and emotional side well enough that it puts Mycroft Holmes, who has been elaborately tracking his brother and hiring government agents to investigate the flat to figure out what's happened to him, to shame. That's a statement I never thought I would make. It's marvelous. Like with Lestrade and the Six Thatchers, I feel like Mrs. Hudson's time in The Lying Detective gives her a chance to contribute in a way she never really has before. And I love it. Una Stubbs has always been brilliant as Mrs. Hudson. Sweet, caring, but not a pushover. But her moments in this episode shine brighter than any of her others.
I'm the widow of a drug dealer. I own property in central London, and for the last bloody time, John, I'm not your housekeeper.
You go, girl. You go, girl.
Plus, it gets the plot moving when the Baker Street boys are being too stubborn, so that's nice. The biggest story element from The Dying Detective they rework here is what's going on with Sherlock. See, here's the thing. In The Dying Detective, Holmes feigned illness to set a trap for Culverton Smith. The worst thing he did to himself to play the part is starve himself for 3 days. And for Sherlock Holmes and his habits, that's not too excessive. But here, Sherlock is not faking it. He has been high on massive amounts of drugs for at least a month by the time Mrs. Hudson comes to John for help, maybe longer. And we know this because it's confirmed by Molly. Behold, the only significant thing Molly does in season 4. The only reason Mrs. Hudson takes him to John is because he goes out of control. Seeing Sherlock slowly but surely destroy himself like this is terrible to see, but man, Cumberbatch sure does know how to make it entertaining, channeling some of his summer Shakespeare work in the process.
For there is none of you here so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes.
One thing that Sherlock's version adds to The Dying Detective is the deeper emotional element. Sherlock wasn't doing this to himself just to catch a bad guy. He was already doing a damaging amount of this stuff by the time Culverton's daughter came asking for help. He definitely amped it up after he realized what this man was to get his attention and put a plan together, but that's not the main reason. I'll go more into Sherlock's motives as they become clearer later in the story, but the first half or so of the episode is watching watching a brilliant man fall farther than he ever has due to the impact of his greatest mistake, only to try his best to crawl back out when the work comes calling. I love seeing the scenes where Sherlock slowly comes back into himself when Culbertson's daughter Faith comes asking for help. In the beginning, he's not able to keep up with his own deductions due to the drugs, but slowly starts to get his mental act together for a little bit once he comes across someone who needs him, recognizing how desperate Faith is and not willing to let her go out on her own. His walk with Faith may be at what is possibly his lowest point, but it displays his best character traits. Although I'm surprised the 4th season of Sherlock was able to film in a tourist trap like Piccadilly Circus without a boy band level crowd. Maybe that's why the scene takes place in the middle of the night. After that, Sherlock quickly becomes obsessed with taking Culbertson Smith down, but nobody believes his claims because he's been high as a kite for weeks. But Sherlock isn't the only one to snap out of his stupor, even momentarily, when the call to action comes. Once John is pulled back into a case, you can tell he sees something's wrong, starting to see the cracks in Culbertson's facade and slowly beginning to believe Sherlock. Though he never says, you can tell by just how much more hesitant and on guard he gets around this guy as he spends more time with him. Another bit of characterization I like with John was when Mary breaks down how Sherlock was able to deduce what new therapist John would be going to. Now, I don't know if this was intentional, but since Mary is just imagined by John, I thought that was a cool way to show that John has picked up on some of Sherlock's skills. I love when adaptations do that with Watson. I think it's a sign of the best of them. But apparently John isn't clever enough on the outside for people to believe he writes his own blog.
You write Sherlock's blog?
Yes.
It's gone downhill a bit, isn't it?
Wow. Was Moffat reading the recent reviews when he wrote that? Still, it's always fun to see Sherlock play up their detective celebrity status. It's been a while. As uncomfortable as spending any time around Culbertson Smith is, it might be the thing to get everyone back in the groove. John is getting defensive around this guy, Culbertson is slowly showing his true colors, Sherlock's got a plan in motion and an unearned level of confidence. This might just work out. Except there's one problem. When Sherlock calls Faith to spring her on Culbertson, it's not the woman who came to Baker Street. The differences are minimal, but they are there. A reveal that is like a tidal wave washing over the events. The buildup is very suspenseful and effective, and once it happens, everything comes crashing down. Sherlock can't stand the contradiction caused by the drugs he's been taking. It takes away the small amount of faith anyone had in his claims, and in his manic state, John is forced to subdue Sherlock, and in the process, lets all of his anger out.
Is this a game?
Oh, this scene. This has become a rather infamous moment among fans. For many, John beating Sherlock up in a fit of rage was a step too far, and it has left a stain on the character. And I get that initial reaction. I do. This was pretty brutal. But in my eyes, this was just all of John's bottled up resentments towards Sherlock coming out at once in the most unhealthy way possible. We all know Sherlock isn't the easiest guy to have as your best friend, and they've had their conflicting moments before. There's one in practically every episode. Sherlock treating everything like a game for him to win, toying with John's emotions, and, you know, the whole pretending to be dead thing.
When have I ever been a malingerer? You pretended to be dead for 2 years. Apart from that,
leading to moments of disapproval, frustration, or straight up aggravation. And most of the time, it's not unjustified. It goes without saying, this relationship is dysfunctional, but most of the time it balances out. Because one, they're both not great at expressing themselves, one's just much more well known for it, and two, most of the hurt is not intended. Neither would do anything to actively hurt the other. When that does happen, it usually comes from a place of ignorance, like a lot of the times when people hurt their friends' feelings. Most of the time they move on or amend things later, but then Mary was killed. That was the final straw. The act itself wasn't Sherlock's fault, but right now, that doesn't matter to John. He needed someone to blame, and Sherlock was right in the line of fire. It's why he's not willing to help, see, or hear about Sherlock after Mary's death. He feels betrayed for the latest and greatest time. His wife died. This should be about him, not Sherlock, for once. Combined with the many times Sherlock has done something selfish or insensitive, the dam broke. This was the result of a backlog of pent-up emotions, and with Mary gone and Sherlock out of sorts, it finally came crashing down. John is hurting, and Sherlock paid the price.
I killed his wife.
Yes, you did.
So, to the many fans who found John's actions to be unrealistic or force-drawn for the sake of the story that assassinated his character, I disagree with you completely. I think John's outburst is perfectly set up and executed, even though it's absolutely horrible and kind of hard to watch as it quickly destroys both of them. Once John gets in there, he went way too far, and Sherlock did not deserve that, no matter how much Sherlock believes he did. It wasn't a justified reaction, but it does make sense. There's a difference. He definitely feels bad about what he did, but John Watson, stubborn, emotionally repressed man he is refusing to admit that to anyone, especially himself. In his eyes, Sherlock did this to himself. He took things too far, and he's paying the price, and John can't take it anymore. Ready to cut Sherlock out of his life for good, leaving his cane behind for him while he's in critical condition at Culverton's hospital. Remember this for later, it's important. Until a very special lady is able to put things back into perspective for him, Mrs. Hudson. Well, okay, it's technically Mary, but Mrs. Hudson led them to the message. See, in the end of the Six Thatchers, Mary left Sherlock a message, giving him a case to save John Watson. But we only saw part of that message in the last episode, which is why I didn't bring it up before. The way they reveal the entire message in The Lying Detective is not only highly enlightening to Sherlock's actions over the course of the episode, but it makes for a very intense climax as John slowly realizes what's going on while Culverton is getting ready to kill Sherlock. And before we really dive into that, I have to emphasize Toby Jones' creepiness again. Like, at this point, when he shares that his motivation for killing people is that it makes him happy to turn people into things, makes this guy officially the most disturbing villain in the show's history. This moment of Culverton taunting a presumably dying Sherlock Holmes is another scene inspired by The Dying Detective, arguably its most famous scene, outside of maybe Holmes' ramblings about oysters. Come to think of it, I'm surprised they didn't manage to sneak that in there somewhere. Anyway, it's a real slow-moving, intimate scene between our hero and villain, but it makes my heart race. It carries the same on-edge air to it that moment in the book did, but in true Sherlock fashion, it twists the mystery element of one of the classics to enhance whatever is going on with the characters. This set of scenes in The Lying Detective has the same feeling of slowly realizing what's actually going on. That Sherlock did all of this, got stupid high on drugs for weeks on end, picked this fight loudly and publicly with Culverton Smith, and went to all that trouble to recruit John in on the case when he wanted nothing to do with him because his friend asked him to save his best friend. Without Mary, all they have is each other, and I think she might have known that John would do what he ended up doing, shutting people out. She was clever like that. So she set out to make sure John would get back out there, and the only way to do that would be to get John to do what he does best: save Sherlock Holmes. There's a great line Mary has where she states that John Watson never accepts help, but he never refuses it, which, when you think about it, is something that's been true of him since day one. You could argue that's why therapy didn't cure his limp, but running after a potential murderer did. Not to say therapy didn't help in other areas, otherwise he wouldn't have kept going, but if you want John Watson to charge into action quickly, apparently you put Sherlock Holmes in the clutches of a serial killer. Works every time. In fact, you could easily see a lot of parallels between the climax of this episode and the climax of A Study in Pink. Sherlock still had some of his wits about him, planning all this so he had the smallest possible chance of dying, so he was exaggerating slightly, but not by much. And it's clear the drugs were interfering with his senses considerably, but he was still more than willing to risk his life and his health to not just stop a reprehensible man like Culverton Smith, but to save John from himself. Like the good doctor has saved Sherlock time and again over the course of the series. And John does end up saving Sherlock and stopping Culverton Smith, not just by charging in to stop the bad guy, but by being so damn predictable.
How does it open?
Screw the top.
That was a really clever twist on Watson listening into this confrontation in the original story. Good job, Moffat. But even when John does come around because of this elaborate plan, and later finally does admit that Sherlock wasn't responsible for Mary's death, which was nice to hear him say, when all is said and done, they actually sit down and talk things out. I think for the first time ever. Usually when these two have a fight, they're able to brush it all off with the adrenaline of a case. But this isn't like their typical disagreement. disagreements. This was a lot bigger and left a more permanent scar on both of them. While the climax of this case is strong and works on a thematic level, things went so far this time that to have Sherlock pull some kind of stunt and have them both wave things off like usual would have felt disingenuous. So they actually talk about their feelings for once. While John's confessions are definitely the most impactful, I want to take a second to go over Sherlock's admissions, since I feel they're just as important to the after events of Mary's death. Even after John assures him that it wasn't his fault, he hasn't forgiven himself for what happened to Mary. When you think about it, if Sherlock hadn't followed the trail of the statues and kept going because he needed an answer so he can stop the bad guy like he usually does, Vivian Norbury probably would have remained in the shadows and never would have hurt Mary. Mary's sacrifice was still her choice, but you could see how Sherlock would feel responsible for the consequences. After narrowly escaping death and destruction too many times to count, it finally caught up with him. And the worst part is, he didn't pay the ultimate price for that.
In saving my life, she conferred a value on it. It is a currency I do not know how to spend.
He's not over it. Sherlock doesn't know how to see what value Mary saw in his life to sacrifice her own, which is why I think he went as far with this case Mary put him on as he did. If Mary had one last request for him, he was going to fulfill it no matter what it took. It's one of the few moments in the series where Sherlock opens himself up to vulnerability and admits his own inferiority, which is immediately forgotten about after a very familiar text alert goes off.
It's the text alert of Irene Adler. She's the scary mad one, right?
Oh my god, this reveal was so freaking funny. I still say that whatever strange relationship Sherlock and Irene have isn't traditionally romantic, but I just find it so amusing that she's still in contact with him. I did not see that coming. And why is Irene texting now? Because it's Sherlock's birthday. There's not much to say about either reveal here, but they add an extra bit to Sherlock's character, and it's kind of charming to find these things out that I can't not mention them. Also, fun fact, while Sherlock Holmes' date of birth is never given in the original stories, fans have estimated it to be January 6th, and this episode premiered on January 8th. Coincidence? Probably, but I like to think it was planned. What is significant about Irene's interference here is John's reaction to it, wanting Sherlock to grab an opportunity to have a connection like he had with Mary. While that's not something Sherlock finds value in, you could see why John would be so insistent on it now that Mary's gone, and he admits why he loved her so much. Because he wanted to be the wonderful man she thought he was. This moment, coupled with John's actions over the course of the episode, is where I think that sentiment shines. Just think about the duality of what he's been doing all this time. For most of the episode, John doesn't want to deal with Sherlock and his troubles. The only thing that ever convinces him to get involved again is Mary. The Mary John imagined, who basically acts as his conscience. It's his way of convincing himself to do the right thing. For most of the episode, John is the worst of himself. Stubborn, temperamental, and short-sighted. The only time he shows his better colors is when Mary leads him on the right path, including in the message she left Sherlock. If John didn't see that, he might not have gone to help, by his own admission. And of course, we can't forget the infidelity, no matter how much I want to. I still don't like the infidelity, and I think this moment where he confesses it to Mary to make up for the fact that he didn't get to before she died, ironically explains why. This episode already shows that John has other faults, and made it clear how much his relationship with Mary shoved them aside, or made him act on his better qualities. His actions here would have been enough to show that he's not perfect, and just like Sherlock, can go too far on the side of his unflattering traits without someone to ground him. He only stops seeing Mary after he airs it all out in a way he never got to while she was alive, and promises to do everything in his power to be the man she knew he was, even if she can't see that anymore. This is some of Freeman's best work in the series. It's a real lump in your throat scene. It's beautiful and devastating all at the same time, but not as much as the hug. All the Tumblr girls love the hug, but even without those goggles on, it is a really sweet and vulnerable moment that you don't see often with these two. But again, this is a special occasion. If it was going to happen at any time, it was going to be now. It's the perfect moment to end so much heartbreak. Luckily, we get to wrap up this whole endeavor on a lighter note. Things aren't perfect, but they're getting better even if the scars are still there. Everyone seems to be getting back into their regular lives, including Mycroft, who might finally be taking Sherlock's advice from the empty hearse with Lady Smallwood. But we're not done yet. There's one more reveal. In the last minute, we find out that the woman John was texting, the mysterious woman Sherlock met claiming to be Faith Smith, and even John's therapist are all one person. And who is that person?
Isn't it obvious? I'm Eurus.
Who?
Yeah, Sherlock and Mycroft's secret brother they've been hinting at, turns out it's their secret sister, Eurus Holmes, played by Cyan Brooks. But since that's a discussion for the series finale, I think we should wrap up on The Lying Detective first. Overall, The Lying Detective is hands down the highlight of season 4 for me, though it's not an episode I revisited often until recently because it's such an intense and disorienting watch. It's almost exhausting, but it's exceptional work across the board, using the creative foundation of this incarnation of Sherlock Holmes and twisting it to fit this ever-collapsing situation. The cast is stellar yet again. Its reinterpretation of a classic story is striking and captivating. It utilizes everything at its disposal to tell the story in the most mesmerizing way possible. It didn't pull any punches with either its threatening villain or the severity of the consequences of Mary's death on an emotional level, and this brutal 90-minute adventure makes the ultimate reconciliation feel well earned, even when it only technically took one episode before things went back to normal. This might be the best script Stephen Moffat has turned in for the program on his own since A Study in Pink, at least in my opinion. Having strong thematic elements, taking advantage of underused parts of the series, and sprinkling in that extra bit of funny charisma in the dialogue, and moments of genuine sincerity that I see more often in Gatiss' scripts. It's an episode I admire a lot and took a lot of risks that I think in the end paid off spectacularly. Well, the year of Sherlock's 10th anniversary may be coming to an end, but we've still got one more episode to go. Next time, the game that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson have been playing for all these years will conclude with the case that will definitely be the most challenging to tackle for both our heroes and me in The Final Problem. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.